Thank you for joining us as we talk about our new edited collection, Research Methods in Labour Law, a Handbook. I'm really delighted to be talking about this with you today and to be joined by my wonderful colleague, Professor Sean Cooney, who works here with me at Melbourne Law School at the University of Melbourne. This edited collection has been many years in the making, and so it's really wonderful to see it being published by Edward Elgar in August 2024. And we thought it was a great chance to talk a bit about the collection, some of the chapters, and the things that we're really interested or inspired by in this new book.
So, Alysia, it was your brainchild. So, what have you found most exciting about this?
So, what I've really loved is being able to bring together so many different authors from all over the world. And we really worked hard to get a really interesting array of voices in this collection. So, partly it's about bringing together lots of different authors, lots of different career stages, and lots of different perspectives on theory, but also on research methods. And I think that's been really great. But what really interested me was, while we gave the authors quite a broad brief to talk about different methods or theories, what's really come out from this collection is a real focus on voice. So while we were giving authors voice, they've really focused on how we enable voice in our research methods themselves. So that, for me, was really interesting that came through so strongly.
Yeah, I have the same view. And of course, a lot of labour law traditionally has been mainly through Western scholars, and that's fine. But we did make an effort to try to get voices from the global south. We didn't always succeed, but lots of really interesting perspectives from Latin America, perspectives from Asia, and so forth, and often from quite young scholars. And as well as that, we have Indigenous perspectives too, with the whole chapter about yarning. So I was really pleased about that. And I think, there's further to go, of course, but we've made a good start.
Yeah, and I think we're really seeing this as kind of opening up these conversations and encouraging people to be more reflective about the methods that they adopt, more kind of critical maybe about how they approach that, but also thinking about these new ways of doing things in labour law. And I think that for me is really exciting.
Yeah, the interdisciplinarity really jumps out. So you've got more traditional perspectives like law and economics, or doctrinal perspectives, but also more anthropological points of view, a focus on time, a focus on utopia. And this, I think, really, as you say, gives people coming into the discipline more opportunities to say, well, I have a background in this particular area and I want to use that when I approach questions of labour regulation.
And I think that's one of the things that's really vibrant about labour law research, is that we are open to these whole diversity of perspectives. And I think that really comes through in the collection, kind of that tension in some of these approaches, but also that diversity of perspectives. I think it's one of the real strengths of the collection, is that it encourages people to think in creative ways about how we pursue research.
Yeah, so, and I hope it's useful from that point of view, not only for our colleagues and the people that we see at international conferences and so forth, but for students coming through, particularly research students, doctoral students. And I would also say policymakers. I was thinking about this because, when you see new labour law coming out or regulatory proposals, you often wonder, well, who is it targeting and who isn't it targeting, and which voices are left out. And a lot of the authors do speak to that. More broadly, I am glad that we started looking at questions around informality. Having just spent a lot of time in South Asia, I'm very conscious that the formal labour system only covers a number of a small percentage of the workforce, and so you see the importance of looking at what is regulating all the other people, and we have some chapters that start looking at that question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that informality, the fishing of the workplace, it raises really challenging questions for our research methods, because often our data sets don't capture those sorts of working arrangements, but they're becoming more and more prevalent. So it's a challenge to our research methods, but also an opportunity to think more holistically about how we enable voice.
Yeah, and we've come a long way from sort of post-Second World War labour legislation and labour scholarship. So, rightly responding to the horrors of the Second World War, you have this sort of focus on the sort of stable industrial enterprises and unionism, and so emerging and secure employment. Of course, that continues to be important, but the wider world is not reflective of just that experience. And you can see this long history of more and more voices emerging. And I think we see that in this work, as you say, with younger scholars, people from the global south speaking about their experience.
So, Sean, where do you think these conversations will go next? We're opening up conversations.
Yeah.
What do you think the next steps are?
It's interesting because I was thinking, what didn't we cover?
Yeah.
And so there's lots of questions that are, that we haven't really gone into. So an interesting one, I put three very contrasting views. One is law and religion, so a colleague of mine from Pakistan just wrote a book about an Islamic labour code. There's a lot of debates about Catholic social teaching and labour law, and while in a way this might seem looking sort of to things that were in the past, in fact this is very alive in many jurisdictions. So that kind of law and religion area is an interesting one. The intention is law and queer experiences, and how much is law built on, the sort of traditional view of a family. What happens when, many people in our society don't experience that? So that's another perspective. And I think an area which you know more than me, but going into the technology space more, and perhaps hearing from cognitive scientists, from people working in AI very closely and understanding that, like they're areas that all of those areas which are kind of quite disparate, are ones that we could explore.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to me, something that really emerges from these chapters is kind of the growth of data.
Yeah.
And so partly that's about technology and new ways of collecting data, but also about how do we use data in research.
Yeah.
So we have a handful of chapters here about quantitative methods, which I think scholars in Australia and the UK haven't used to the same extent as scholars in the US, for example. But I really think as we get more and more data of different quality, perhaps, but that's really an area where we need to be scrutinising, using, critiquing, but also thinking about the new research possibilities.
Yeah, I remember doing a stats course about a few years ago and going, oh, whoops, a lot of my previous research is quite questionable. And I think, often people sort of run away from mathematics and statistical analyses, but it's really important to get some understanding of it. We're not statisticians, but having some grasp of how to use data. And when you're looking at something like informality, the data is really sparse and difficult to read. And if you're looking at, again, developing countries that don't have the same agencies and capacities. So working with information in that space and understanding its limitations, I think is really important.
Yeah, and I think that's where we as labour lawyers really offer something, because, maybe we're not so keen on maths or stats, but I think we bring this critical lens to these sorts of topics that's really beneficial.
Yeah.
And something that comes through for me in this collection is really where lawyers add value.
Yeah.
And kind of the vibrancy of the field and the need for specifically legal research in this space. So, we often look to interdisciplinary perspectives, but also recognising the benefit that a legal perspective brings as well.
Yeah, and I think, I tend to now look at legal as regulatory, and bringing it back to the real world implications of a perspective. So it's informed by all this different data and different disciplines, but lawyers are concerned with regulation, and many people, if my country might be, well, what do we do next with the Fair Work Act or the Work Health and Safety Act or with equality law? And so, I think with all these research methods, bringing it also back to kind of normative goals is an interesting question as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where our theory is really critical.
Yes.
And so what's nice about this collection is it brings together both theoretical perspectives, but along with the methods.
Yeah.
And thinks about how you might connect your theory and your method, because that's really critical too.
So where do you think, you asked me where could we go next, where would you like to sort of go next, not that we're looking at another thing right at this point.
To be clear, we are not looking at another book at this point.
But what do you think sort of the future offers in terms of?
Yeah, I think the future is really bright.
Yeah.
And I think what's nice about this book is it draws out those contestations and the tensions and the debates. So I'd like to see the debates continue to
Yeah.
emerge and with the same level of vibrancy,
Yes.
because there's real vibrancy and real excitement, I think, in these chapters. And I think that excitement exists despite a global pandemic
Yeah.
and despite so many challenging demands on all of our contributors. So I think it's really a triumph of kind of endurance in some ways.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the other thing is too, what I find exciting is I haven't, is that sense of I hadn't thought about that before.
Yes.
So the chapter on time, for example, I'm like bringing together what I would have thought were disparate areas into, under the theme of time and how important time is. You go, oh, okay, right. So that going forward, offers the possibility of really interesting insights and new ways of seeing existing scholarship and so forth.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And even new ways of seeing methods that we already use.
Mm.
So the chapter on doctrinal research, it offers kind of this new way of thinking about doctrine, which might be seen as really black letter and boring, but actually in this chapter it's quite subversive and quite critical.
Yes.
So I think even new ways of seeing things that we already know about as well.
Yeah. And just to go back to some of the contributions from, say, non-Western scholars, I spent a lot of time looking at China, and then the chapter by Yen Qian, who's at Peking Law School, was about socialist law. I think it's been heaps about socialist law, but the kind of experience of a specific socialist system going through the last sort of 40 years was like, oh, okay, that's how the understanding of a concept like socialist law actually changes with political developments, with economic developments, and so on. So even something that I thought I knew pretty well, I'm like, oh, okay, right, this is a quite new way of looking at things from a young kind of emerging scholar.
Yeah. And I think it's safe to say that we've both learned a lot through this process.
Absolutely.
And about things that we didn't expect to learn about,
Yes,
new areas, new ideas. And I think for me, it's really re-energized my thinking about labour law research and the new possibilities that might come through.
Yeah, I really, getting surprised is a really nice, or, oh, I didn't sort of realise that, especially if you're sort of kind of later in your career and you're like, oh, I've seen it, sort of, you're like, oh, no, I haven't. I haven't been paying attention. There's all these new sort of ideas emerging, and I really like that, actually. That was one of the favourite things of reading something going, oh, wow,
Yeah.
So that is an important point of the book, and as you're saying, like it's not that we covered everything. There were, I mentioned before, a number of areas that we didn't cover, but at least you get quite a good sense of diversity, quite a good sense of lots of different ways of viewing things, and hopefully, people that read it will also be surprised and also go, oh, I hadn't thought about that before. I mean, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely.
As an outcome. Yeah.
And so we originally thought this collection would be for emerging scholars, those commencing masters or PhD studies in particular, looking for methodological inspiration. I think those who will benefit and enjoy this, it's actually a much broader group of people. And actually for those who have been doing this work for a while, I think there's real benefit in delving into some of these chapters.
There is. But also, as I referred to before, policymakers, because there's a certain way of producing law, and often that does involve consultation and sort of economic analysis and so forth. But some of the chapters suggest that maybe there's other perspectives that need to be brought into that process in the real world, in inverted commas, and not just in developing countries, which I think is most obvious. Like Olivier's contribution from Brazil talks about informality there, but also in societies like Australia, where you have the Indigenous perspective and yarning, that's not been part of our labour law tradition at all, and yet sort of it's hidden in plain sight, as it were. So I think, again, at that policy level, there's also things to consider.
Absolutely. And even drawing connections between different areas of regulation.
Yes.
So like labour law and climate, and thinking about these big global challenges and how they impact or interact with labour law, and how labour law kind of impinges on them.
And that's an interesting one. That's Ju Chong's chapter, and I see increasingly out of the ILO, for example, the International Labour Organization, a lot of work on climate change because of heat, we've seen, that's just one example of the impact, obviously, but the heat across many parts of the world and what that means to working patterns that are outdoor. And we've had increased emphasis on health and safety, perhaps about time.
Yeah.
So that's just one illustration of kind of systematic changes that are needed to deal with these events that in the past were just much less common.
Sean, thanks so much for the
Thank
chat.
you.
And we hope you enjoy the book as much as we have.